Hello, welcome to Under Another Name. Hi, Joe.
Hello, James. You ready to go? You
I'm
didn't,
ready
you
to
didn't
go.
seem
Yeah.
sure before we came on.
So today we're talking about the present political moment, and the key sort of focus of this episode is on
Do
the
you know what it is?
hegemony of, or the seeming hegemony of Tory rule. So, for example, we just had some polling out today. Now, we like to remind our viewers that you should never look at one poll in isolation, but even if you look at the trend, it's clear from the trend that the Labour position at the moment is weakening, and the Tory position remains strong. What do you think is going on, John? And then I'll give my 2 cents maybe in a second.
Yeah, looking forward to really getting into this today. I think I've had a few kind of questions on the back of previous shows we've done about, some people just saying to me like, what is going on with the Tories? There are people who kind of will say to me like, I kind of buy your analysis of maybe Starmer is uninspiring, sort of to some extent alienating some of his own core support, but it still just doesn't explain just how well the Conservative Party is doing. And it's worth, I think, before we go into some of the reasons, it's worth just reminding ourselves, the record of the last 18 months is dire. And we are looking at one of the highest per capita death tolls in the world, one of the worst economic recessions in the world, presided over by a government that promised to build back better and to level up, and also to be a kind of model of competence in comparison to the supposedly dangerously radical Jeremy Corbyn. So in terms of like what, from sort of like for a lot of people, they would say like, surely, yeah, just like what should have happened? This should have been the moment where everybody just sort of agreed that Boris Johnson was just not a credible leader, and everything fell apart. And I feel like that's been the Labour Party's strategy under Keir Starmer, is the expectation that will happen and waiting for that moment. And it's been badly miscalculated, as we've seen. And the reason for that is because there's much more to the Conservative strategy than previous eras of Conservative leadership, for example, under David Cameron, when there was very much an emphasis on like competence, steady, middle of the road style management of the economy and politics, in the interest particularly of the kind of comfortable middle class who the Conservative Conservative Party has traditionally depended on. Actually, under Boris Johnson, you've seen a genuine recalibration of who the Conservative Party are pitching to. And again, I had a conversation this week with someone saying to me, yeah, but that's just like nonsense. It's just sort of, it's all rhetoric. And I think a lot of it is rhetoric. I think a lot of the levelling up agenda is rhetoric, but there's also just enough that of real credibility in terms of, for example, changes to corporation tax, some of the measures that you're seeing with people like Ben Houchen, just recently re-elected as the mayor for the Tees Valley. He's a guy who's talked about, public ownership, like big spending from his budget to try and bring investment up to that region, backed very strongly by the Prime Minister, who's been up and sort of patted him on the back and spoken in warm terms about him. So I think obviously in politics, there's always a lot of branding and there's a lot of kind of PR and spin involved. But I don't think that's a good enough reason to just dismiss this rebrand as an entirely vacuous exercise. I think the Conservative Party have worked out very effectively how to build a new electoral coalition that is potentially very sustainable for the next 5 to 10 years. And, my view at the moment is Labour's analysis of what happened in 2019 was very poor. Their analysis of what was going to happen next is even worse. And at the moment, there's every reason to assume that we are at best halfway through a long period of Conservative hegemony. And that raises lots of questions about how people should be responding to that. But I think probably for the first part of the show, we just need to get into some of why.
Can I just get into a bit of that? So hegemony on the right. So I was looking back at some data, looking back at some previous elections, and the key thing that May and then Johnson have managed to do, because they both managed it actually. May managed it in 2017, Johnson manages it in 2019, is to effectively kill off the right. If you go back to 2015,
I think you can rephrase that, but I think I know what you mean. But you mean to bring the right, to unify the right.
What did I say?
You said to kill off the right.
What you mean to kill off the parties who are to the right of them? Yeah. So if you go back to 2015, parties to the right of David Cameron's Conservative Party made up 12.6% of the vote in 2015. That was largely UKIP. In 2017, parties to the right of May's Conservatives 1.8%, and then under Johnson 2%. And effectively, the Brexit Party, I can't even remember what they've renamed themselves, have disappeared from British politics. And so that's, it's critical to understand this because we go from a position under Cameron where he's describing the UKIP as fruitcakes and loons to a position under Johnson where the so-called fruitcakes and loons are enthusiastically voting for the Conservative Party. And indeed, many of his own MPs are what might formally be described as UKIPers or Brexiteers. Then there's a question of why that is and why it's so successful. Well, first thing I'd say about this is that one thing that's always true of the Conservative Party is that they are absolutely committed in a way that the left are not, because we've got more principles. They're absolutely committed to power and doing whatever is necessary to win power. So the heart of conservatism for me, when I'm talking about it with my students, is pragmatism. They're willing to be pragmatic for power. And that, by the way, is the reason why this brand of conservatism, which should be an anathema to those who would describe themselves as Thatcherite, because it's at least performatively statist, and authoritarian, which is the opposite of what a sort of libertarian conservative should believe. That is why it will hold together for as long as Boris Johnson can maintain his poll lead, and there's no evidence of that going anywhere. And what it amounts to is authoritarian nationalism, and that is done performatively by engaging in culture wars. And I'll come back to that idea of performativity because I think it's quite important. And a sort of pragmatic statism. And what I mean by that is he's willing to invest, but he's wanting to invest partly in a performative way. So in other words, the levelling up agenda is not quite what it seems. It's in my view, to some extent, it is nonsense. It's not real. But where he is investing, it is in red wall seats, and it's in areas of the country where the Conservatives want to hang on to support that they've just won from the Labour Party. Coming back to this issue of performativity, because it's important, I got really agitated about the Queen's speech the other week, and in particular, I was agitated by something that the Queen's speech said about rebalancing the relationship between the executive and the courts. Following the Gina Miller case, the second Gina Miller case, where Boris Johnson was found to have acted illegally in proroguing Parliament, he had put in the Conservative manifesto that he was going to attack the Supreme Court, and it found its way into the Queen's speech. And that got me really exercised. But actually, if you look at the detail of what's being proposed, it's really nothing of the sort. So I think a lot of the time with Johnson, you need to really look at the detail, because a lot of the time will be wanting to whip up a culture war over an issue, whereas actually I think in a lot of cases, when you actually look at the legislation, there's going to be not much to it, and effectively he's going to have achieved his objective, because what Johnson is brilliant at is campaigning, and what he's really trying to do is solidify his base around the sorts of issues that get them riled up.
Yeah, so I agree with you about the performativity, right? That's hugely important in the Conservative Party's current strategy. We need to talk about identity politics here, right? So one of the things you hear a lot in kind of like contemporary political debate is like the left is addicted to identity politics. It's obsessed with like, you know, this woke agenda and sort of like, you know, people's, you know, prioritizing people's right to be offended or whatever over other, you know, issues of free speech and so on. But of course, if you want to see the kind of like the policing of identity politics, you have to look at the right and the Conservative Party. So the Tories are brilliant at weaponizing perceived attacks on the kind of like stereotypical straight white male, this kind of like defense of that sense of like selfhood of those who are like traditionally deemed to be like at the top of like, or are at the top of various social hierarchies. The Tories have worked out that group of voters are fed up with what they see as these kind of attacks on their history and their culture, their identity, and they've really weaponized that very well. Now, I agree that some of that is in practice quite harmless. I'm not a fan of the current measures around free speech at universities, but I'm not convinced actually they're going to make a whole lot of difference. They certainly got the university's minister into a fair bit of kind of embarrassment in an interview the other day where she ended up justifying Holocaust denial on campus. But like, that's the kind of thing you can expect when they're, you know, the underlying ideology is just so confused. No one's really thought it through in any depth. But we need to be careful because sometimes measures that are partially just performative will also have really serious real world consequences. So I'm thinking here about the policing bill, has potentially very, very serious consequences for free speech, which we've spoken about before. It's obviously on its way through Parliament at the moment, although it's a long, there's still a way to go. But also, of course, for the GRT community, it's potentially devastating. And so very often you'll find that people are just like collateral damage. And I'm thinking here, particularly vulnerable people, minorities, will just be collateral damage in this process of trying to signal, virtue signal, if you like, or, you know,
anti-virtue signal, maybe.
To the anti-virtue signal to your base that you're on their side.
Let's be clear about what I mean by performativity and what I've done, right? There are some really serious attacks on the right to protest, on traveller communities. Those are real threats and we should take them seriously. What I'm saying is there are other areas that I have noticed, like the attack on the judiciary, where the bark is much, much, much bigger than the bite. And I think that is done intentionally. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that because at the heart of Johnsonism, at the heart of his ideology, is an attempt to solidify that electoral base. And he does it in a very Schmittian way. There's a political philosopher called Karl Schmidt, who's a Weimar philosopher. He ends up being a prominent part of the Nazi Party during the Nazi era. And Schmidt's conception of politics is that, at least in democratic politics, politics is all about the moment of the decision. And in the moment of the decision, what you're doing is you're dividing friend from enemy. In other words, the nature of politics is quite dark, really. And Johnson, I think, conceives of politics in a similar way. What he's interested in doing, and he's got a laser focus on this, which partly explains actually his flexibility ideologically as well, is he's going to help his people. He's going to help the 40-odd% of people who voted for him in order to keep them in his electoral coalition. And anybody that falls outside of that is open to attack because actually attacking them, the moment of decision, dividing between friend and enemy, is central to his electoral success. And ultimately, electoral success is all that matters to him. I would go that far. He wants to remain in office.
And I would say with Johnson, you know, if you could make him take a truth serum, which is kind of an extraordinary thing to think about with Johnson, because this is a guy for whom the truth is essentially irrelevant. But if you could force him to just confess the truth, he would absolutely say very proudly that for him winning is all that matters. Like that's absolutely his conception of politics. And I think this Schmittian analysis is really helpful for understanding him, because he absolutely has that ruthlessness. But of course, and this has always been observable with Johnson, he also knows very well that the best way to do that kind of approach to politics is also to play the clown. Because if you play the clown, then you can always deny at a certain level the kind of the ruthlessness of the strategy. You can always offset it. You can leaven it with a kind of a humor, a sort of offbeat kind of, undercutting of the narrative, so that the people who are potentially going to kind of attack you as a divider, as a, as someone who is divisive and potentially cruel in their politics, how can you think that of Johnson? He's kind of this, I don't obviously personally think this, but he's kind of playing this kind of lovable, cuddly clown. Can he really be that bad? Can his decisions really have cost tens of thousands of people's lives? Surely not. He's just some, cuddly old English, chap who, nobody could possibly object to. So I think that's the part of the genius of the strategy does lie within Johnson's own character and the projection of his personality, and it's also a projection of a certain kind of idealized, in certain sections of the population, idealized Englishness, which again plays into this strategy of like, you're talking to this particular group who are particularly animated by that sense of like the bluff kind of, inverted commas, truth-telling Englishman who doesn't, bother about political correctness. And that is really important with Johnson. And I think this is, Johnson is, we always have to remember this. He's very specific to his political moment. He's not just someone who could have succeeded in any age. In an age where the kind of liberal model of politics had become kind of tired and strained. So this sort of like the model of David Cameron and Tony Blair, these people who are PR men, who do see their job as essentially just a sort of like removing of the content from politics and just sort of like projecting this bland competence to the public and avoiding like, saying anything really that could be kind of deemed interesting or controversial in any way, and also just steering a course, following the kind of the established narrative around the economy. So you're kind of like essentially going with the flow of market economics. That has become that's done real damage to people's faith in politics, particularly after the financial crisis. That whole model of politics ran out of road. And I think it's really interesting now. You'll hear people say, that there isn't really a center ground in politics. Like that's become something that people in the media have started to acknowledge now. That was the kind of thing that wasn't really acknowledged when Corbyn was leader, because it was something that was used against Corbyn. But I think now with Starmer's leadership, people are suddenly saying like, oh, hang on, maybe it doesn't work. Or if there is a center ground, it's actually sort of like in two different places at once. It's kind of on the left in economic terms and on the right or in cultural, social terms, which is sort of contradictory, but I understand what's meant by that idea. And Johnson has positioned himself in that space, but just, it's worth just reflecting on the fact that that's almost, I would say, almost a total inversion of the Blairite Cameron model, where you essentially went kind of left-ish on social, cultural issues, and you stuck to the right on the economy. So Johnson has recognized that, and he has pivoted absolutely to where he needs to be. And the result is, and we shouldn't forget this, between 1992 and 2017, by my count, there were, I think, 6 or 7 elections. And the Tories, I think they won like maybe 1 or 2 small majorities in that time, right? One in 92, one in 2015, neither of which lasted very long. So the Tories haven't actually been, for 25 years or so, a particularly effective election winning machine. It was Johnson and Cummings who recognized how they could use the political moment to maximum advantage. And it's epitomized, if I just finish with 2 things, both of which I was reminded of today. So one, there's an Economist article today saying, you know, this model that the Johnson government is adopting is unsustainable, it's very dangerous. And it's just like, yeah, of course the economists think that, you know, because for you guys, you basically were the decision makers. You were the people setting the agenda in the neoliberal era, you know, Thatcherite and post-Thatcherite. Well, we're not in that era anymore. You know, the days when the economist would kind of like set the political agenda are gone. And, you know, of course, they're going to keep on pronouncing the demise of this form of politics because it's totally anathema to them. But, you know, maybe they need to recognize that it might be more sustainable than they think. And the best example of this, of course, is Boris Johnson with that famous kind of private comment some point during the Brexit negotiations, fuck business. Now that probably more than anything else tells you about the modern Conservative Party. And there was huge amount of like wringing of hands and sort of shock and how can a Conservative say this? And obviously, you know, he was spot on in terms of his political analysis. He absolutely nailed it. There's an irony, of course. Jeremy Corbyn couldn't have said that. He would have absolutely been dragged by the press. But Johnson understood that a certain type of anti-PC, let's cut through the crap, you know, we can't, you know, we've got to stand up for the left behind in a context of also rejecting sort of woke orthodoxy. Balancing those things would really energize a section of the electorate in a way that neither David Cameron or any of those Conservative Party leaders, his predecessors before him and after Margaret Thatcher, were able to do. So it's a really effective strategy.
Yeah, I've got so much stuff to say off the back of that. But let's start with, so you described Boris Johnson as left-wing at one point, and I just want to press...
No, what? Hang on.
Moving left on the economy. Moving left on the economy. That's left, yeah. Whether you said that or not, it's something people say, and I think it's kind of right. Yeah, it's certainly right performatively, as I say. The talk about levelling up, but it's not right in this sense. Johnson's statism is, first of all, animated by winning elections. It's a fundamentally pragmatic statism. There's nothing behind it ideologically, in my view. I could be wrong about that, but I haven't seen any evidence of that so far. And secondly, if it is a form of statism, it's a form of state capitalism. The point of his interventions have been to prop up the capitalist system and to support capitalism. So what he's doing is not particularly left-wing in the sense that he's trying to create a statist model of capitalism that is sort of harks back to an earlier era of conservatism, maybe more Macmillanite. But I think we need to stop calling it left-wing. In a sense, it is, but you can have forms of left-wing politics that are very statist and forms of left-wing politics that are not very statist. So I think focusing on his statism, but not ignoring the fact that he's using that statism to support capitalism, as is very evident during the COVID crisis. Now, the second thing is, I think you give Boris Johnson a bit too much credit.
Very rare.
In the sense that the bridge between a Cameronite conservatism and a Johnsonite conservatism is Theresa May. So Theresa May is the first Conservative Prime Minister to ditch austerity. She talks about just about managing. She has a genuine agenda that is left-wing, as it were. And of course, whether she's forced into this position or not, she's the first Conservative Prime Minister to say very clearly, Brexit means Brexit. In other words, she adopts a hardline position on that particular element of the culture war. Now, whatever you happen to think of why she did that, Mayism is clearly a bridge towards Johnsonism, and all Johnson does is comes into power and adopts the kind of Schmidtian ruthlessness that I describe. He realizes he needs to ditch the Remainers in his party in order to secure the Tory hegemony. And actually, in terms of the percentage of the vote at the election, he does ever so slightly better than Theresa May. So, I think it's important to focus on Theresa May because, women are often ignored in history, and her role is actually quite crucial. I think it's a semi-tragic role that she plays. But Theresa May's role, I think, is critical, because I think without Theresa May, you can't have Boris Johnson. She makes a significant move. Just a few more things. Just returning to what I said earlier about Schmittian politics, this division between friend and enemy. The other thing that Karl Schmidt talks about in the concept of the political is an idea called the state of exception. And what he means by that is that sovereignty for him is sometimes about finding an extra constitutional moment. It's about breaking through the fetters of legality or breaking through the fetters of constitutionalism. In other words, it's about finding a gap in the constitution. Put more simply, it can be about breaking the law. And this is something we've seen is evidently part of Johnson's politics. He was willing to prorogue Parliament when that it was disputed whether that would be lawful or not. It ended up being deemed unlawful. And there's some legislation coming through about refugees, that the government are willing to propose legislation in defiance of international law in relation to refugees. There was another bit of legislation a while back, I'm forgetting the detail, where they also were willing to break the law. So that's another point. So he's a prime minister that's willing to break the rules of politics at the very least, and maybe even willing to break the law in order to get what he wants done, because again, all he cares about is securing that electoral base. The final thing is, I'm saying that some of it is performative, right? And I'm not saying that in a dismissive way. I actually want to make a really serious point about performativity. Johnson the clown, Johnson the performer, Johnson the person that says, we're going to do this stuff, we're going to attack the judiciary, we're going to attack immigrants, we're going to attack travelers, right? Some of this stuff is real and a genuine threat, and we need to be out on the streets protesting about it. But the stuff that's not real, well, what does that do to our politics? It legitimizes a mode of doing politics that I think at some point in the future will lead to the re-emergence of the far right, because they're being legitimized by the language of our politics. So there's a fundamental amorality about this. He doesn't care that he's doing this. He knows that he's doing it. And, at some point it's going to lead to a situation where voices that are further to the right than he is, that have been sidelined by his brand of politics, will re-emerge in a serious way and start doing things or start proposing things for real, like attacking the judiciary. That's the real threat of Johnsonism. That sometimes that when the performance ends and the real political actors come out of the woodwork, things get really dangerous.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just highlighting what some of that language is. Like this talking about sort of like, the woke metropolitan elite is the kind of thing that for Johnson is really just sort of like a riff. Like it's always important to remember that, of course, Johnson is the woke metropolitan elite. He just literally embodies it. He's brought up in precisely the same set of circle that David Cameron was raised in, for example. He's got or he had for a long time, he lived in Islington with his wife and his kids. This is a guy who absolutely emerges from that set, and he uses it half knowingly as a kind of riff. And he knows it's deniable with his kind of circle of mates, people who are also in that set, but who kind of like Johnson, who maybe, edit a national newspaper or whatever, will understand that they're not talking about them. But I think you're absolutely right. As that language becomes just embedded in our understanding of politics, it becomes incredibly dangerous. It becomes absolutely the way you see people who are utterly, I think Johnson is ruthless, but people who were kind of like wedded to a much more violent form of politics than Johnson is, will be using that same language. And so I think I absolutely agree. I think it is amoral, and I think that Johnsonism won't last forever, and you can't do the kind of like clown deniability performance that the current model of conservatism relies on without the right leader. So if the Conservatives then have to go to a different kind of leader who doesn't have that aura of deniability about them, then they will just have to double down. They won't be able to play this kind of game where you kind of stand back from some of the rhetoric and you nudge and you wink because you've got the kind of character to do that. So I think I've said before, I think we should be really, really worried about where this goes. Where in terms of are we seeing this kind of an embedded conservative hegemony? I think in terms of electoral politics, given the divisions on the left, given current legislation around voter ID and the potential impact that that's going to have on marginalized communities who are more likely to vote Labour, more likely to vote for progressive parties. Again, that's a quite deliberate policy agenda. Everybody knows what the game is there. Nobody actually thinks it's about dealing with voter fraud. Everybody understands this is about everybody who's involved in it, including people who are going to write leader articles in major newspapers saying it's a good idea because we need to combat voter fraud. All of those people understand that the agenda is to embed the hierarchy of the Conservative Party for potentially a generation. And I think because the Labour Party after 2019 understood Corbyn's defeat as a return to normality, as a return to, okay, now it's back to serious politics and we will challenge the Tories on competence and we will outflank them. Corbyn wasn't able to do that. We can do that, particularly with a leader like Sir Keir Starmer. They totally misread that the way in which you've crystallized politics as this game of dividing friend and enemy. I don't think that the Labour Party should be engaged in trying to demonize anybody, but I do think it should be clear about standing up for the people who it's supposed to stand up for and mobilizing them, organizing them, and resisting a really dangerous moment. But I don't think Theresa May is a tragedy. I think it's a tragedy that in this moment of real danger, the leader of the opposition is literally the least suited person to the moment. And that's not I think I've said this before. It's not even a dig at Starmer particularly. I'll say a little bit about the graph on the screen in a moment. It is sort of eye-watering, really. But it's just a simple statement of fact. There are other political eras. I don't think Starmer is particularly a brilliant politician in any respect, but there are other eras in which he would have been a more credible leader of the opposition. But you probably couldn't pick a worse moment to have Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party than right now, and that is borne out in those approval ratings. I think it's worth just bringing back on the screen just to illustrate how bad things are. And the point I would just make on this, you just have to, when you look at this, down sort of 48 points in terms of whether voters think he's doing well as leader of the opposition. Well, two things. One, look at how it's collapsed since November 2020. So it's such a stark turnaround. It's not, one of the many myths of this is, Starmer is turning round a weak position. Starmer's own credibility ratings show the opposite of that story. But the other thing that really is just stunning is to remember that this is not a guy who's had a bad press. This is a guy who, generally speaking, is written up positively in most of the national newspapers, including generally hostile ones, as a kind of breath of fresh air for the Labour Party, someone who's making it more professional, less extreme. He's essentially had just generally, positive appraisals, and he's still absolutely tanked.
Yeah, if we compare the position of Starmer to other leaders of the opposition, the only two that do worse are Foot and Corbyn. And as you say, they were facing a considerably worse press. I mean, Corbyn's numbers come from September 2019, towards the end of his time as the leader of the Labour Party. And Michael Foot's from 82, the party he leads was in such a state of civil war that it split. And of course, he was pilloried by the press for being, this rabidly left-wing leader of the opposition. So I think, for Starmer to be where he is in terms of the opinion polls, for him to be, I've just brought up Lord Adorno without realizing it, for him to be on -48 at this point in the political cycle is absolutely catastrophic. I did just want to return to the right, though, because I think if my analysis is right, and if the success of the Conservative Party owes more to the fact that Johnson has solidified the electoral space on the right, then the fact that there's a weak opposition on the left is problematic, but it isn't the problem. The problem is there's a lack of division on the right, and so we've got to start thinking, well, is there any threat there? Now, I think there is a little bit. And I'll explain why it isn't a threat in the short term, or maybe even the medium term. But if you look within the Conservative Party and you ask, where are the Thatcherites? Who are they? They do exist. In fact, there's a body of politicians on the right who wrote the book Britannia Unchained. Many of them are in the cabinet. Some of them are on the backbenches. These people want a radically different vision of the state. They want a radically different vision of the economy to what Boris Johnson seems to want. And then if you think about the broader party, taking in not just those who are formerly members of the Conservative Party, but also those who broadly share conservative views out there in the public, are there people out there that are going to have misgivings out there in the public, but also in the press, if the direction that Johnson has taken conservatism in continues? Well, absolutely yes. So you are going to see some opposition to Johnson's conservatism from the Thatcherite right at some point. The reason I think we can downplay it a little bit is, coming back to what I said right at the beginning, there's one thing that conservatives prize above all else, and that is power. And what Johnson has, that they will fear attacking, is he can win elections. He is their star. Like Mrs. Thatcher was able to win elections in the 1980s, he's able to win elections. But I think the left need to focus a little bit more on who Johnson is, what he actually believes, and why he is so hegemonic on the right. And again, if my analysis is right, moving the Labour Party towards conservative territory is just not going to work, because the whole project that Johnson's engaged in is about stoking up these divisions. And so, I'm quite skeptical about that.
Yeah, I mean, you've had recently, I forget exactly which Northern Conservative MP it was, but they were praising the Preston Model. So the Preston Model is this idea of, like, forget the exact phrase that's used, but it's kind of like investment within the community, like community wealth building, basically. It is sort of statist. But it nevertheless involves a real attempt to inject investment into communities like Preston, which historically have more recently are seen as kind of left behind parts of the country, and build up community infrastructure, state organized state capacity in ways that really transform the lives of the people living there. And we know that it's been very successful because that group of Labour representatives in Preston were successful in getting re-elected quite comfortably in an otherwise disastrous performance for Labour. So they're generally seen as quite left-leaning within the Labour Party, right? This is not a group that are particularly aligned with Starmer. This is the other wing of the party, and you've got Tory MPs praising it. So what you've got here is a situation where the Tories have got that flexibility. They can move into those positions that Starmer has kind of almost walled himself off from. He can't go there now because he's kind of signaled to everybody that he's not going to do that. This is like this new sensible, restrained kind of model of Labour politics that appeals to, newspaper editors, but doesn't actually have much appeal to the wider public. And I think my comment on this kind of like, yeah, but what about the Thatcherite wing of the Conservative Party? Yeah, I mean, it's partly true that they're committed to power, but also I'd almost ask the Peter Mandelson question: where are they going to go?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of the Preston model is that it's almost like a response to the austere conditions that councils find themselves in. Now, I'm not an expert on the Preston model, but I think what it's about is it's about councils saying, look, we've got this pot of money that we're going to spend to provision local services. We're going to spend that money locally. And so the idea is that you build up the community's wealth by ensuring that the little money that you do have, because council budgets have been utterly slashed since 2010, you invest in the community. So it's kind of statist, I guess, but it's more about empowering the community and building up the wealth of those areas. And yeah, I agree. The only way for Keir Starmer to challenge Boris Johnson is by really thinking ideologically. This is what leaders of the opposition have to do. They have to define a space in politics that is open to them and isn't merely mirroring what the other party are doing. So Johnson's cleverness is to realize that there's a strain of thinking in the left that thinks essentially that being left-wing is simply about tax and spend, that being left-wing is just about hiking taxes up and spending on public services. And Johnson's really comfortable with that. He's very happy to go into that territory. Now, the challenge for Labour then is to return to a model of left politics that isn't about that, that is about more than that, and actually maybe even returning to a brand of left politics that isn't all of that committed to thinking that the answer is always the state. Yeah. And what I mean by that is it's a politics of genuine common ownership. It's a politics of giving power back to workers. It's a politics that's about not nationalizing industry, but creating cooperative industries, giving football clubs back to fans. And that model is there. It's on the table. It's available. The left of the party have been talking about it for a very long time. Yes. So you know, the problem for traditional left positions or the sort of Labourist position is that tax and spend is what he's doing. So if you're going to find a distinctive ideological position on the economy, it can't really be that. And what I think you could actually do is to take some of the ideas traditionally associated with conservatism and say, right, well, you're not talking about freedom anymore. We'll talk about freedom. I'll tell you what freedom is. Freedom is going into your workplace and actually having a stake in that workplace, going into your workplace and actually having a vote in your workplace, going into your workplace and knowing that you've got a decent day's pay that you can spend on you and your family. Yeah. That's what freedom is. So I think there's an opportunity here, and Labour need to Labour need to embrace the good thought that's going on the left, and I think there's a way of moving into Tory territory, as it were, in a much more imaginative way than just standing in front of a bloody flag. I mean, it's absolutely nauseating to me. One of the things that's exciting about being on the left at the moment, I know I'm on a bit of a rant, is that there are ideas out there. Yeah, there have been for a very long time. Yeah, and by the way, many of these good ideas started with Ed Miliband, but
here we go. I mean, look, whether or not that's true, those ideas have also been developed within the circle around John McDonnell for the past 4 years, and some of them have found their way into Conservative Party thinking in the last couple of years, but with, of course, as you say, a really important caveat, which is that for all the talk of levelling up, the spending is very partially distributed, right? So first of all, you're not distributing it through local councils, particularly in sort of like traditionally Labour areas where the councils are still Labour held. You don't sort of re-empower those councils. What you do instead is you create these new kind of centres of political power. So these mayoralties, for example, so people like Ben Houchem, and you give them the cash to spend, and you make it very clear to people that this is a Conservative investment in their communities, which they see their communities as having been starved of investment for a long time. Labour have held those councils for a long time. Now, the fact is that, under austerity, it was a Conservative government depriving the Labour councils of money, and that's still continuing. But you can present this as a kind of Labour failure to invest versus Tory investment. And again, there's an element of just like good old fashioned pork barrel politics here. You target that investment at where it's politically advantageous to do so. And again, that's very successful. There's every reason to assume that the Conservatives will continue to solidify their control in those areas, as was demonstrated in the local elections, and that while there is some evidence of a kind of a Tory retreat in their heartlands, in the southeast, for example, it's happening at nowhere near the same speed as their increasing dominance in the so-called red wall parts of the UK. So there's plenty of time in which they can then readapt the model as becomes politically necessary. But I think at the moment what's happening in Labour is that the choice was made, and I think this was a choice, to kind of focus on an internal battle, essentially defeating all of the people who are generating the kind of ideas you're talking about, as a means of signifying to what are supposed to be the gatekeepers of political debate in the national press, that Labour is now kind of detoxified and can be safely kind of returned to by voters who've abandoned it. And actually, what we're seeing is that doesn't work, because those gatekeepers are not really actually having the influence that was assumed that they had. I think also there's an element with the current Labour leadership that they see their hegemony within the party as, in some sense, paramount over the question of whether or not they win an election. There's no other explanation, to be blunt, for the kind of chaos that broke out over the previous weekend, the attempts to sack Angela Rayner, then the kind of frantic repositioning as that fell apart. If you're serious about winning power, you don't do this. You don't start trying to sack like prominent working class women from your front bench at a time where you're widely pilloried for having lost touch with the northern working class, which Angela Rayner represents. So there's clearly something kind of just destructive happening within Labour now. I think there's a sense in which the expected returns haven't materialized, and there's a degree of just like panic breaking out within the faction of the Labour Party that are now in control. And I don't think they've got a way back, because to me, and we'll see, right? And this could be wrong. It might, there's some sign in the last couple of days that Starmer is sort of trying to talk in terms of like, Joe Biden's political success, trying to sort of imitate some of the Biden quote unquote radicalism on economic policy. But there's a real credibility issue. At this point, that what that graph tells you, people will say with opposition leaders, and this is true, it takes time for people to get to know them, to make up their minds about them. Well, the evidence of this is people hadn't really got to know Starmer for quite a while. And they were slowly kind of making up their minds. Well, in the last 4 to 5 months, they've really made up their minds. And I don't know if now people are going to listen very much to what Starmer has to say. Like he had potentially the worst possible fate for an opposition leader, which is sort of a joke.
Yeah,
I mean, a very dangerous place for an opposition leader to be in.
Yeah, we could be wrong. I think the analysis is there, though. As I say, I think most of the problem is the ignored section of this. That if Johnson can hold on to his position amongst the right, and if he's not challenged on the right, then I personally think there's at least 40% of voters that are unattainable for Labour, and so the problems we're having over here on the left. Well, I think personally we're going to have a long time to sort them out. Now, I'm just going to come to some questions. I think we've had some today, so we've got this one, which is opposite to what we're talking about. Do you think Labour's decline is terminal? Now, my answer to this is no, for several reasons. First of all, I think that politics is messy, that stuff happens, that we can't predict the future. And I actually think that the business of opposition, whilst it's important, is less important than what's going on the other side. So if the government, for example, if there were to be a huge financial crisis, which is possible as we come out of this, then I think the government's credibility could be under attack. There are just, as Donald Rumsfeld says, there are unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know about what the future holds, and politics is a difficult business. The thing about Johnson is he's very good at winning elections. He's not very good at governing, and at some point, the fact that he's not very good at governing will catch up with him. I don't know how that will happen. I don't know when it will happen, but I'm very confident that it will. The issue, I guess, is, again, going back to the thing I've said repeatedly throughout this show, the one thing the Tories care about is winning elections, and they will ditch Johnson as soon as he stops being electable.
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem for the Tories in the fact that Johnson is inevitably going to blow up at some stage. By all accounts, Sunak is seen as the guy waiting in the wings. We'll see. But I think you're right to say that we can overstate Labour's impact on this, in a sense in which this is more a story about Tory hegemony than it is about Labour's decline. But I do think also the two obviously can influence each other. If Labour had some kind of strategy for the last 6 months, it would have made a really material impact on politics. We would now be having a different conversation. We might not be talking about hegemony. We might be looking more closely at what was going on in the south of England and saying, whoa, hang on a second. There's some real trends here that should be very worrying for the Conservative Party. So I think the reason I don't think it's terminal is because the people who think it's terminal, their analysis rests on a total misreading of politics, which is basically that Labour's traditional heartlands have turned against it because it's too woke, and it's inevitably just like sliding into obscurity, etc. It's worth remembering Labour won a big increase in its vote share in northern seats under Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. It's lost a big share of its number of heartland seats in Scotland, but that wasn't because it was too woke. That was to do with the question of Scottish nationalism, and Labour is on the wrong side of that question at the moment. And it's by no means clear to me that woke politics is the problem. The problem is a lack of clarity about what Labour is proposing to do in any kind of constructive way that will improve people's lives. I think if Labour can articulate something, and as I say, I think there are real, and James has spelled this out well as well, there's some real flaws in the Conservatives' position that can be exposed. If it can discover some energy and some purpose, then yeah, these things can turn around very quickly. But I do think that Keir Starmer is terminal. I don't think he's going to succeed as leader, whether that's in the next year or the next 2 to 3 years. And I think there is a big problem for the Labour Party, which is it does lack any clear sense of who it wants to be led by, who does it want to stand up for. I think there are answers. I think again, James has said this. Labour is, in some respects, or rather the left, has almost kind of led on certain questions, particularly economic questions, over the past 5 years. There's a real irony to it. There's been the left has almost set the agenda on the economy since Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the party in 2015, and yet that's mostly benefited the Conservatives. because they've essentially been able to adapt to that changing consensus and kind of peel off Labour voters in constituencies where actually a lot of those constituencies, people feel let down by the Labour Party because they've been the people who've actually run those constituencies and held power in them for a long time.
I mean, just to throw a bit of a spanner in the works, the other possibility, and it's obviously a small percentage chance, is that the Labour Party are replaced by a party that are genuinely left-wing, and we're seeing some signs of that. The Green Party are the party, I think they're in the best position to do it. They're going to challenge in seats like Bristol West at the next election. They're the only party that across the board picked up seats in the council elections. And so I think it'd be interesting to watch the Green Party. I wouldn't mind at all if that happened, but it's another possibility.
Oh, yeah.
I thought we would finish with a silly question. Would you have a pint with Boris? And if so, what would you talk about? Joe, would you have a pint with Boris?
I would. What would I talk about with him? I'm kind of trying to answer that question seriously. It's a really hard question to answer because the whole idea of like having a pint with Boris is sort of because you want to kind of just have this jovial banter with this guy. You know, that's the essence of his appeal. But I would want to ask him, you know, I guess I want to ask him questions. I want to probe him on how does he reconcile these contradictions, these gaping contradictions in his own like political identity, you know. So like he's kind of a free marketeer, but he also says fuck business. You know, he's someone who has been like historically quite liberal for the Conservative Party on things like migration. But then is also now leading this government, which is, you know, deliberately and like emphasizing a very punitive line against migrants in order to energize its base. So I guess I want to talk about stuff like that, but he would just respond by going, you know, and it wouldn't go very well. But that's what I would probably ask him.
Yeah, I'd have a real moral dilemma about this. So I'm not sure what my answer would be in the end.
This is such a classically left-wing thing, is it? We're just like,
curiosity would probably get the better of me, so I'll probably end up
that's
going,
how I feel. Yeah,
a bit like going on a date and not quite sure whether you'll like the person.
That's a horrible thought, James. Jeez,
going on a date with Boris Johnson is a horrible thought.
That's great. That's a real that's a sobering note on which to finish this week's show. I think like we're in an age where I think it's very dangerous to make predictions about what's coming. And like, you know, Johnson has definitely captured this particular moment, and his sort of ability as a shape-shifting politician has sown massive confusion amongst his enemies, which of course is very often what happens. And you have people kind of fighting against the old version of the Conservative Party that doesn't really exist anymore. And so Johnson is kind of free to just dominate the space that he's moved to because everybody else is still busy fighting these old battles. So look, I think what Johnson's success shows is that there is real appetite for some real transformative politics. And actually people, you know, to be fair, I think it also shows that people don't just want empty words. Yes, I think a lot of Johnsonism is empty words, or a section of it is empty words, but some of it is more than that. You know, some of it is about real investment in their communities and improving the quality of their lives. And, you know, there's a lot of kind of, you know, we've had a lot of horror from sort of liberals over the last few years about the extremes of Johnson's, you know, his actions around, you know, his willingness to break the law, for example. But, you know, there's the kind of like that liberal consensus about politics, what you should and shouldn't do, that very narrowly defined form of politics that was dominant for 20 years or more, it's been very damaging to a lot of people's lives. And it's understandable that people want to smash that. They want to see it smashed.
Yeah. If I could end with a final thought.
I'm not advocating, I'm not saying, you know, we should break the rule of law, we should have governments that break the rule of law and, you know, upend kind of like norms. But what I am saying is, you certainly, you know, being like the head boy in your kind of, you know, how you present yourself to the public is sort of like, you know, goody two shoes type character that I think Starmer sort of portrays is just not going to wash with anyone. It's not going to interest people. So, you know, the Labour Party has to sort of be willing to show that it's willing to break things if it wants to. And I don't, certainly, break through a lot of the consensus that has been very dominant for a long time. And as I say, you know, you see this appetite. There's a real appetite for something new.
I knew that would happen, Joel. I knew if I tried to interject because I knew I'd forget what I was about to say. And I knew you would plow on, and you did plow on. You said very little, actually, but I've now completely forgotten what I wanted to say to sum things up. But like students in a lesson, you know, when you come to them and they're just sort of have a brain.
we've done our hour here, haven't we?
People need to realise I was at A&E last night until 1 a.m, so I barely slept.
You were accompanying.
Not
you weren't.
Indeed, I'm very well. Okay, well, we'll finish things there. We've been under another name. Is that what we're called?
Oh, jeez. We have been under another name. Like
we used to be called something else. We used to be called something else.
That's why we're called under another name, because we're under another name. I know. Like and subscribe. Thank you so much for listening or watching. It's been lots of fun.
Bye-bye.